This is another one of those church holidays where, the post office is just slammed and it's a little, anxiety producing in case you haven't gotten out all your Christ the King cards on time, wondering how you're going to manage your time off and figure that all out. It's kind of like the Arbor Day of church festivals, right? It's like, what is that, Christ the King? It's kind of interesting. This last week at staff meeting, Tim pointed out something that I was unaware of, which is not terribly unusual, actually. But I did not realize that this festival came into being in recent memory. In fact, when I think of people like Don Ostris, you might say almost within living memory. Now, Easter, as you might imagine, that was a pretty early festival. That one started right out of the gate, right? Christmas comes along. These are pretty early ones. But when we talk about Christ the King Sunday, the very last Sunday of the church year, next Sunday is Advent 1, our first Sunday of the new year. So Christ the King Sunday. In 1922, Benito Mussolini was raised as leader of Italy. Now, I know you were driving here today wondering if Pastor Matt was going to mention Benito Mussolini. But in fact, in 1922, he was raised to leadership of Italy. And in 1925, the Pope, who happened to be Italian, realized that there was some loyalty and allegiance and, dare I say, worship of Mussolini in a way that said, that's it. We need a new festival of the church. We're going to say that Benito Mussolini is not king, but Christ is king, but that was too long. So they just went with Christ the King Sunday. So that's where that comes from. Now, as Americans, we often tend to look at situations like that and say, those silly folks in other countries that have problems that we never have in the United States, funny how they have dealt with them. However, I would suggest that at times we struggle also. There was a movie that came out a couple of years ago that I think touches on this point a little bit, or at least a certain scene did. Some of you perhaps saw the film Zero Dark 30. So this film is about the Osama bin Laden raid. And the first half of it is about the intelligence leading up to it, and the second half of it is about the raid itself. And at the conclusion of the raid, when the soldiers perceived that they had been successful in their quest, they radioed back the code phrases. And in this month, particularly with Thanksgiving coming up, as we think of our indigenous sisters and brothers in this country, the code word was Geronimo. Geronimo. And then came a phrase that is ubiquitous in American, and I would suggest maybe many other nations throughout history, for God and country. Geronimo. For God and country. First century Christians would be absolutely horrified at that phrase. The idea that the empire and Christ are on the same page would have been something that would have been unspeakable and unimaginable. And yet, in our context, that's kind of a warm-the-heart, patriotic kind of phrase. God and country. Well, what does this look like? When we have the text that we have for today, on Christ the King Sunday, we've got 4 Gospels, we've got all of this whole Bible here, and what are the texts that are going to be assigned that might help us dive into this idea of Christ the King? And we get this reading from John, where Jesus is having, or Pilate is having an audience with Jesus. So let's back that out just a little bit. I mean, who is Pilate? Pilate is the Roman governor of that part of the Roman Empire, headquartered in Jerusalem. That was not, if you got to pick where you wanted to be a governor, where you would pick to go. Because the place was a hot mess geopolitically, and Pilate was not known as a softy. He was a tough guy, or perhaps in our modern language we might say a strong man. Maybe not unlike Benito Mussolini. There we are, another reference. So Pilate is this guy, and he is trying to figure out who Jesus is. And he's got a box that he wants to put Jesus in. And this box says king. Now, this box has a certain look. Kings, the emperor, would have been strong. They would have been the ones who would have put down rebellion, who would have united the empire by force for God and country. That is the empire. That is king. Now, Jesus was having a problem because there was another group of people that wanted to put him in a box as well. But it wasn't quite the same box. At least it had a different label on it. The label was Messiah, or the Greek word is Christ, which we need to remember is a title. It was not Mary and Joseph Christ and their boy Jesus. It was Jesus the Christ. And in this idea of the Messiah, people knew what that looked like. It was different than a king, but strangely similar. This would be someone descended from the line of David, which would immediately conjure up specific images of a nation united, of strength of arms for God and country. Now, when we think about the readings that we have today, and we think about our modern American context, this starts to get complicated. One of the quotes that I heard after the judgment and the jury response on Friday that was the most disconcerting to me was one from a congressman who was announcing to their constituents, "Be armed, be dangerous, be moral. For God and country." Right? For God and country. Is that kind of how you picture Palm Sunday? Jesus coming in on the donkey with all the poor behind him. For God and country. No, that's not really what Jesus is about. The Jewish leadership is saying, "Are you going to be in our box?" Pilate is asking, "Are you going to be in our box?" And Jesus says, both of those sound like a lot of fun, but no. I'm not going to be in either of those boxes. My kingdom is not from here. Sometimes this Sunday is referred to as the Reign of Christ Sunday. In some ways, Jesus is expressing where his authority comes from. Where his authority comes from. It does not come from the king, the emperor. It does not come from an election. It comes from God. It comes from heaven. And this image of this kingdom of Christ is one of love. It is one where the peak moment of exercising who Christ is witnessed most directly in his death. Usually in movies that we watch that are about our culture in North America, when the hero dies is not really the forgotten country moment, right? That's usually when somebody lost or failed. And yet it is in that vulnerable weakness of death that Christ shows strength to us. Because our world shows strength by projecting power over others, and in fact, even by projecting death towards others. That's something that we struggle with in our society. The idea that we've come to a point where we have normalized teenagers with long guns in streets. The sense that when we talk about God and country, as though those fit on the same sheet, as though Christ wants everything that we want, as opposed to this image that Christ is calling us to be about something different. Something different. After the September 11th attack, there were all kinds of news stories that would come up, perhaps about some lone wolf attack, and often the question would be, how were they radicalized, right? How were they radicalized? We see a lot of radicalization going on, but I think this text pulls on us to ask that same question if we say that our citizenship is from heaven. What does it mean to be radicalized for Christ? Is it a for God and country kind of scenario? A power over others? Or is it rather following in the sacrificial example of Christ, where we show love to our neighbor even when they are hard to love, and even perhaps when we find it hard to be loved? Is that the kind of radicalization that the Reign of Christ Sunday is calling us to be about? In a climate and culture that is about God and country, are we called perhaps to say, Christ is King? I am called to love my neighbor. I am called to love them when it's easy and to love them when it is hard. But Christ is my King. So I would challenge you as you hear the text for today and as you understand this Sunday, the reign of Christ, Christ the King, to understand that as baptized people of faith, our citizenship is not from here. And we are called to follow Christ in his example of sacrificial love for the world. Amen.